Hello and welcome to the Enhancing Your English podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Demi, and today is episode 5, Days and Time. Now, of course, when a person learns a language, whether it's their native language or a second language, over time they're going to learn a lot of vocabulary. But I think with most of the words we use every day, we never really think about where they come from. So today, I'd like to start by looking at the origins of the days of the week in English and talk a little about why they have the names they do. Now, before I go into the origins of the English words, I'm going to go back a little further in time, back to when the Romans were in Britain, because this is going to help us understand how the English words were later chosen. The Romans ruled part of Britain from the middle of the 1st century to the beginning of the 5th century. And with Roman rule, of course, came the Latin language. So let's take a quick look at the names of the days of the week in Latin. Now, the Latin name for Monday was Dies Lunae. Even though the first word here looks like dies, D-I-E-S, it's pronounced dies and means day. The root luna means the moon. So, dies lunae means day of the moon. And you can see the root luna in a few words in English. For example, a lunar eclipse. This is when the full moon is darkened by the Earth's shadow. And also in a lunatic, which means a crazy person. This word comes from the idea that some people had in the past, and they thought the full moon or changes in the moon could make people go crazy. Next, Tuesday in Latin was called Dies Martis. This translates to Day of Mars, and Mars was the Roman god of war. Wednesday in Latin was called Dies Mercurii. This translates to Day of Mercury. Mercury was the Roman messenger god. He had wings on his feet, so he could go very fast. Just like the planet Mercury, which is the closest to the sun, travels very quickly around the sun. Thursday in Latin was called Dies Iois, and this translates to Day of Jupiter. Jupiter was the king of the Roman gods. And if you're wondering how you get Jupiter from Iois, my understanding is that the word takes the first part of Iois, Io, and combines it with the Latin word pater, which means father. So, if you combine Io and pater, it comes out as Iopater. Over time, the Io sound became more pronounced like a J, making it today's word, Jupiter. Friday in Latin was called Dies Veneris, and this translates to Day of Venus. And Venus was the Roman goddess of love and beauty. Saturday in Latin was Dies Saturni, and this translates to Day of Saturn. Saturn was the Roman god of farming and agriculture, and he was also the father of Jupiter. Finally, Sunday in Latin was called Dies Solis. Now, the root sol in Latin means the sun. So, this translates to Day of the Sun. Sol can also be seen in English words such as solar power and solar panels, and also in solar eclipse. Okay, now Roman rule in Britain lasted to the beginning of the 5th century. And after that, we start to get the invasions and migrations into Britain of many Germanic and Northern European groups, like the Angles, which is where the name England comes from, and also the Saxons, the Jutes, and later the Vikings. They eventually took over large parts of Britain, and they brought their Germanic languages and cultures with them. So the names of most of the days of the week were changed to Norse gods and goddesses. Norse basically means Northern European or Scandinavian. However, for most of the days of the week, there are strong connections between the English names and the Old Latin names. And in many cases, the Germanic groups simply switched the Latin names with words or gods from their own language and culture. Now, Monday, as it's pretty easy to see, is the Germanic word for day of the moon. So the Germanic groups basically switched the Latin words for day of the moon with their own. And they did the same kind of switch for Tuesday. Tuesday means day of Tu. Tu was a Norse god, and just like the Roman god Mars, he was also a god of war. Wednesday means day of Woden or Odin, and Woden was the head of the Norse gods. Now, for this one, it's not so easy to find a strong connection between Woden and the Roman god Mercury. The connection that's most often given is that both gods guided the souls of the dead in the afterlife. But for this one, there's not an especially strong connection between the Roman and the Norse gods. Next we have Thursday, which means day of Thor. Thor was the son of Woden and the Norse god of thunder. His connection with the Roman god Jupiter is although Jupiter was the king of the Roman gods, Jupiter was also a god of thunder. Friday means day of Freya, and her name is often spelled a few different ways. She was the wife of Woden, and just like Venus, she was also a goddess of love and beauty. Now, Saturday still means day of Saturn. And this is the only day where the Germanic groups did not change the name of the Roman god. And it's not clear why they kept this name, but it's the only day of the week in English where the name still has its Latin roots. And finally, Sunday means, well, not surprisingly, day of the sun in Germanic. So this gives us a brief look into why we have these names for the days of the week. Now, next, I want to turn my attention to time. And when you see a time like this, have you ever wondered what the AM and PM stand for? Actually, both of these are also Latin. In AM, the A stands for ante, and the M stands for meridium. Ante means before, meri means mid, and diem means day. So ante meridium is Latin for before midday. Now, it is possible to see ante in other words in English, but it's not very common, and the words you can see it in are usually pretty difficult. One example is the adjective antebellum. We know ante means before, and bellum means war. So an antebellum period would be the time before a war. But in English words, it's actually much more common to see the root pre, which is another Latin root that also means before. And you can see pre in many words, such as preview, predict, and pre-war, which is much more common than saying antebellum. And one more thing, I just want to make sure that you don't confuse ante, A-N-T-E, meaning before, with anti, A-N-T-I, which is a different and pretty common root that means opposite or against. For example, you can see anti in words like antisocial. An antisocial person is someone who doesn't want to talk or be around other people. Also, in the word anti-war, which means being against or opposed to war. Okay, now getting back to time, how about PM? PM stands for post meridium, and post means after. So post meridium means after midday. And post is a pretty common root in other English words, such as in postpone. If you postpone something, it means you have to reschedule it or do it later. You can also see it in post-war, which means after a war. And one more quick thing about time. Sometimes when I ask English learners how they would read this time, they answer oh, it's 5-5. But that's not right. When you have a time like this, please remember that you have to say O for the 0. So for this time, you would say it's 5:05. Now, before we end today, the final thing I want to talk about is actually a question that I want to ask to my Japanese and maybe Chinese listeners. To my listeners from other countries, I apologize, but this is a question that's bothered me for a while, and I haven't been able to find a good answer for it, so I just want to take the time to ask. A while ago, I realized that there was a connection between the names of the sun, moon, and planets in Japanese and the names of the days of the week in Latin. Now, here's the Japanese kanji character for the moon, and Monday in Japanese uses that character in Getsuyobi. In the same way, Monday in Latin is dies lunae, day of the moon. Okay, the planet Mars in Japanese is Kase, and the same kanji character is used in Tuesday in Kayobi, and Tuesday in Latin means day of Mars. Mercury in Japanese is Suisei. That kanji is used in Wednesday, Suiyobi, and Wednesday in Latin is day of Mercury. And that same pattern continues the rest of the week. Jupiter is Mokusei, Thursday in Japanese, Mokuyobi, and in Latin, day of Jupiter. Venus is Kinsei, Friday in Japanese, Kinyobi, in Latin, day of Venus. Saturn is Dosei, Saturday, Doyobi, and in Latin, day of Saturn. Finally, the sun character is used in Nichiyobi, and in Latin, it's also day of the sun. Now, this is obviously not a coincidence. There's a connection here. And I've tried to do some research on this in English, but I haven't been able to find a good answer yet. One possibility that I've seen is that this naming system began in the ancient Middle East. It came to be used by the Greeks and Romans, and also eventually made its way to China and the classical Chinese language. It's suggested that writings using this system may then have come to Japan with the famous Japanese Buddhist monk Kukai, or Kobodaishi, after he studied in China in the beginning of the 9th century. But I've been trying to get a clearer answer about this connection for a while now. So if any of my listeners has any information about this, please let me know. Please send me an email. I'd really appreciate it. This question's been bothering me for a while, so I would love to get some more information about it. Well, as always, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Enhancing Your English podcast. If you have any comments or questions, you can contact me at kevin@enhancingyourenglish.com. Also, if you like the show, you can help me out by leaving a podcast rating and review at the iTunes Store, or by just telling a friend about the podcast and helping me to spread the word. So, thank you again for listening, and best of luck enhancing your English.